Naomi Evans, a pregnant black woman, boarded her first-class flight with her 6-year-old daughter, expecting nothing more than a peaceful trip. But what happened next left the entire cabin in shock. A flight attendant, eyeing Naomi with suspicion, questioned her boarding pass, despite Naomi calmly presenting it twice. Moments later, police officers were called to the plane, approaching Naomi in front of stunned passengers. But just 5 minutes after verifying her ticket, the flight attendant was escorted off the aircraft and fired on the spot by her supervisor. What triggered such a dramatic shift? Stay with me, this is a story that exposes a reality too many face. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this one. The hum of the aircraft felt distant, as if Naomi Evans' senses had pulled inward, leaving her attuned to nothing but the small hand clutching hers. Ella, her daughter, no more than 6, stood beside her silent, but wide-eyed with curiosity. Children had a way of sensing things, Naomi thought, but they often lacked the language to name it. Ella felt the weight pressing down on her mother, but she could not yet give it shape. Naomi shifted the bag on her shoulder, feeling the strain against her back, but she kept her posture tall. The boarding pass in her palm was crisp, embossed with the unmistakable black letters that read first class. She hadn't hesitated when booking these seats. Comfort wasn't a luxury when traveling pregnant. With a restless child in tow, it was a necessity. Yet, as Naomi stepped onto the plane, she sensed the ripples beneath the surface. The first glance was quick, a brief flicker of uncertainty from the flight attendant stationed at the entrance. Naomi had caught it, a flicker, then a polite but thin smile. A small thing, but Naomi had lived too long, carried too much of this world's weight, to mistake small things for harmless ones. She smiled back, polite, graceful as always, and led Ella down the aisle. The seats in the first-class cabin were pristine, arranged in neat rows like pearls in a velvet box. Naomi could feel the eyes not from the other passengers but from somewhere else. Behind the crisp uniforms and practiced expressions of the crew, she settled into her seat, gently guiding Ella into the one beside her. Naomi let out a slow breath, grateful for the momentary rest. But rest, she knew, was always brief. "Excuse me, ma'am." Naomi's eyes opened at the sound of the voice. She had felt her presence before she heard her name. The attendant stood in the aisle, her smile tight, the kind of smile that stretched but did not soften. The name on her badge read Amanda Blake. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Naomi blinked, surprised but unfazed. She reached into her bag and handed over the small slip of paper. Amanda's eyes narrowed as she scanned the pass. There was no mistaking the subtle shift, small but perceptible. Naomi saw it in the crease of her brow, the way her gaze lingered just a moment too long. "This is for first class?" Amanda asked, tilting her head. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin smile. "Yes, that's correct." There was a pause, a brief moment when Amanda's eyes met hers, and Naomi saw something beneath the polished exterior, a hesitation, an assumption stirring beneath the surface. Amanda handed the pass back with the efficiency of someone determined to appear unbothered. "Thank you," she said, and yet there was something missing from her tone. Naomi tucked the boarding pass away and watched as Amanda stepped toward the galley. She did not miss the way Amanda leaned in to speak with another crew member, her eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi's row. The words were hushed, but suspicion traveled swiftly through silence. Naomi turned to Ella, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "Everything's fine," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, Naomi felt the familiar weight returning like a cloud too heavy to drift. Minutes passed. Naomi thought the moment had dissolved into the ordinary rhythm of departure until Amanda returned. This time standing taller, her posture stiff with something more formal. "Ma'am, could you come with me for a moment?" Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem?" Amanda's smile didn't return. "We just need to verify something with your booking." Passengers were starting to notice, heads turning slightly, their curiosity piqued by the break in the usual pre-flight routine. Naomi hesitated, but not out of fear. No, she hesitated because she had been here before. Perhaps not on a plane, not in this precise way, but in places where she was seen and yet unseen, where her presence was quietly questioned without ever being directly acknowledged. She rose slowly, lifting her bag and resting her hand lightly on Ella's shoulder. "Stay here, sweetie," she said softly. Ella's eyes followed her mother, unsure but trusting. Amanda led Naomi toward the front galley, just beyond the curtain that separated the classes. "I booked these seats weeks ago," Naomi said, her voice measured. "There shouldn't be any mistake." Amanda's gaze faltered for just a second. "We need to confirm that with the gate staff." Naomi felt the shift in the air. It wasn't about the seat. It never was. The minutes stretched as Amanda disappeared behind the curtain. Naomi stood alone, her hand resting gently over her stomach. When Amanda returned, she was not alone. 2 police officers trailed behind her. Naomi's breath stilled, though she kept her face calm. "Ma'am, we've been told there may be an issue with your seating," the officer said, his eyes darting quickly to Amanda. Then back to Naomi. "Could you provide us with your boarding pass again?" Naomi complied without hesitation, but this time, as she handed over the slip, she held the officer's gaze longer than necessary. He studied the pass, his expression softening as he glanced at Amanda. "This appears to be valid," he said quietly. "Is there a specific issue here?" Amanda's confidence wavered for the first time. Her lips parted, but the words stumbled. "It just didn't seem right," she muttered. The officer's jaw tightened. "You're saying this is based on an assumption?" Amanda shifted, her face flushing with something closer to embarrassment than regret. Naomi said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more weight than any words she could have spoken. But inside, a storm had already begun to gather. Naomi Evans returned to her seat with the quiet precision of someone who understood the tightrope she walked. Her daughter, Ella, sat wide-eyed, her small fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. Naomi slipped into her seat, smoothing her dress as if shaking off the weight of what had just transpired. But she could feel the gaze of the cabin around her. The hush wasn't loud, but it was there in the way conversations softened, in the subtle shifts of posture. Naomi had long known the difference between being watched out of curiosity and being watched as a reminder that you did not belong. Ella tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, why were the police here?" Naomi hesitated. "How did you explain to a child that sometimes the world questioned the very space you occupied? That the weight of your skin could invite scrutiny in the most unexpected places?" "They made a mistake," Naomi said softly, brushing a stray curl from Ella's face. "But it's taken care of now." Ella nodded, but Naomi saw the flicker of confusion still dancing in her daughter's eyes. A flight attendant, not Amanda, but a younger woman with softer eyes, approached, offering a blanket. Naomi accepted it with a polite nod. The woman lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but thought better of it. Naomi wrapped the blanket around Ella, tucking it under her chin. Ella shifted, resting her head on Naomi's shoulder. For a moment, the hum of the plane was the only sound between them. But Naomi's calm exterior was a mask. She could feel Amanda moving about the cabin, could feel the weight of that unresolved tension hanging in the air like a stone too large to swallow. It sat there, quietly disrupting the fragile comfort she had managed to build. It wasn't just Amanda. It was the man 2 rows ahead who glanced back just a few times too many. The older woman across the aisle who pretended to fidget with her scarf while her gaze lingered. It was the silence that followed Naomi wherever she went, polished and polite but heavy with implication. Naomi thought of the officers, of the way their eyes softened when they realized their presence was unnecessary. And yet, they had come because Amanda's hesitation had been enough. Naomi exhaled slowly. The doubt of others had a way of slipping under the skin, settling in places you thought were unreachable. The plane shifted gently as it climbed to cruising altitude. Naomi reached for a book in her bag, letting her fingers trace the cover. But the words blurred as soon as she opened it. A voice carried over the soft hum of the engines, a murmur at first, but clear enough for Naomi to catch the tail end. "Some people don't know how to act in first class." Naomi's eyes lifted from the page. Across the aisle, 2 men in pressed business suits exchanged quiet words. One smirked, the other sipped his drink, eyes cutting sideways in Naomi's direction. They weren't speaking to her. Not directly, but they wanted to be heard. Naomi's grip on the book tightened, the leather cool under her fingertips. It was not rage that stirred in her chest. No, rage was too bright, too fleeting. This was something heavier, something that sat beside her like an unwelcome passenger, refusing to disembark. She could not unhear what had been said. but she also could not give it shape. To turn toward them, to demand acknowledgement, would be to invite the spectacle they craved. Naomi stayed silent, but the words settled in the air. She remembered the first time she had felt it, the sense of being a trespasser in spaces others believed they owned. It wasn't in the dramatic gestures, not in raised voices or outright slurs. It lived in the quiet things. The clipped tone when asking for proof of purchase. The eyes that lingered a little too long at the front of a line. The assumption that one could not possibly belong where they stood. Naomi let out a breath through her nose. Steady and slow. This was not new, but that did not mean it did not wound. The attendant returned, this time with a tray of drinks. Naomi accepted a cup of tea, nodding politely. The same two men across the aisle accepted theirs with practiced ease, laughing quietly under their breath. As Naomi stirred the tea, Ella shifted beside her. "I'm thirsty," the little girl murmured, rubbing her eyes. Naomi pressed the call button. It was Amanda who appeared. Her smile returned tighter this time, as if she felt the heat of her earlier mistake. "Yes?" Amanda's voice was crisp, but the air between them bristled. "Could I have some water for my daughter, please?" Naomi's tone was light but unyielding. Amanda nodded, vanishing behind the curtain. Naomi watched her leave, watched the way she moved, brisk, efficient, but burdened by the weight of missteps she could not take back. The man across the aisle glanced over once more. His eyes met Naomi's briefly, and Naomi held that gaze, just long enough to remind him that she had seen, that she had heard. She did not flinch. Amanda returned, setting a small bottle of water on the tray. "Thank you," Naomi said evenly. Amanda opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps an apology. Or perhaps nothing at all, but thought better of it. She gave a curt nod and walked away. As Ella sipped her water, Naomi leaned back in her seat, feeling the weight shift slightly. She would not let it break her. But Naomi knew, deep in her bones, that there were more moments like this ahead. The plane continued to glide through the sky, but the ground beneath her had already begun to rumble. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. But Naomi Evans knew better than to mistake altitude for peace. Ella had drifted off, her small head resting against Naomi's arm, soft breaths warming the space between them. Naomi stroked her daughter's hair absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Out the window, the sky stretched endlessly, a pale expanse unbroken by clouds. The plane felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that hummed with words unsaid. Naomi could feel the tension thickening, not from any one act, but from the accumulation, the stares that lingered half a second too long. The silence that crept in after every interaction. It was an old, familiar tension. It lived in the spaces people thought were too small to matter. She could hear the men across the aisle, their voices no louder than the rustle of a newspaper. "It's just procedure," one of them said with an airy chuckle. "Can't blame the crew for being cautious. You see someone who looks a little out of place and..." His voice trailed off as if the implication alone was sufficient. Naomi's gaze didn't shift, but she felt the muscles in her jaw tighten. Out of place. It was such a gentle phrase. So polite, so civilized, but Naomi knew the violence hidden inside it. Out of place was a scarlet letter stitched quietly into the fabric of black life in America. It followed you into department stores and restaurants, into office buildings and neighborhoods, trailing behind like an unwanted shadow. It whispered through the cracked windows of job interviews and tugged at the corners of polite conversation. You didn't belong, and that fact alone made you suspect. Naomi sat still, willing herself not to react, but a fire smoldered beneath her skin. She had spent years learning how to carry herself with grace, how to rise above. Her mother used to say, "You don't need to fight every battle, Naomi. Sometimes standing still is the strongest thing you can do." But her mother had lived in a different world. A world where survival meant swallowing things whole and pretending not to taste the bitterness. Naomi wondered, not for the first time, if that silence had cost her mother something irreplaceable. Across the aisle, one of the men shifted, his glance flicking toward Naomi just briefly enough to register surprise that she was listening. She was always listening. The younger flight attendant, Clara, Naomi remembered, appeared from the galley with a tray. Her movements were gentle, deliberate, as if she were trying not to disturb the fragile balance hanging over the cabin. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" Clara asked softly, Naomi considered her for a moment. There was no hostility in her eyes, only the discomfort of someone caught between two tides. "No, thank you," Naomi said, offering the faintest of smiles. Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping briefly to Ella. Naomi could see the apology flickering beneath the surface, though it never left the younger woman's lips. It was the kind of apology that said, "I saw what happened, I'm sorry, but I can't fix this." Naomi had seen that apology before. In grocery stores and hotels. In boardrooms and courtrooms. It was the apology of bystanders, the good ones. The ones who knew better but felt powerless to stand in the way. As Clara moved on, Naomi's eyes trailed to the front of the cabin, where Amanda Blake stood near the curtain dividing first class from the rest of the plane. Amanda's back was straight, her shoulders stiff as if she carried the weight of her earlier mistake. But Naomi doubted Amanda saw it as a mistake. To Amanda, it had been protocol. To Amanda, Naomi was the mistake, the anomaly that disrupted the natural order of things. Naomi shifted in her seat, adjusting Ella's blanket, but the weight of the incident pressed against her like an unwelcome hand on her shoulder. The man across the aisle cleared his throat. "Rough day," he said casually, as if addressing no one in particular. His eyes drifted to Naomi, his tone light but expectant. Naomi looked at him slowly, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary. "Every day is rough for some of us," she replied, her voice steady but cool. The smile tugging at his lips faltered. He shifted uncomfortably, turning his attention back to the book in his lap, though Naomi doubted he was reading it. The truth was, men like him weren't accustomed to being reminded of the world's weight, not the way Naomi carried it. Not the way her mother had carried it before her. They were accustomed to existing lightly. Naomi envied them in moments like this, not for their wealth or their suits, but for the ease with which they moved through the world. Unbothered, unburdened. She wondered if they ever thought about what it must feel like to be stared at. To be questioned in places where they had every right to exist. Naomi doubted it. She exhaled softly, brushing her fingers against Ella's cheek. Her daughter stirred, blinking sleepily. "Are we there yet?" Ella murmured. Naomi kissed the top of her head. "Almost," she whispered. But Naomi knew they weren't anywhere close to their destination, not in the sky. Not on the ground. There was still a long way to go. The engines hummed steadily, but Naomi Evans felt the turbulence long before the plane dipped. It lived in the undercurrent, the quiet, shifting glances and half-hearted apologies. Ella stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes as she slowly returned to the waking world. Naomi kissed her forehead, smoothing the loose curls framing her daughter's face. "Are we there yet?" Ella whispered. "Not yet, baby," Naomi said softly. But Naomi wasn't thinking about their destination. Her eyes drifted across the cabin, lingering for a fraction of a second on Amanda Blake. The flight attendant stood near the galley, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Naomi could tell Amanda felt the gaze pressing against her, the weight of her earlier misstep still circling overhead like a vulture. Amanda shifted, glanced briefly in Naomi's direction, and then quickly looked away. It was funny, Naomi thought. Racism never liked to look itself in the eye. A subtle cough came from across the aisle. Naomi didn't turn her head, but she could hear the shuffle of newspapers, the faint rustle of a jacket sleeve. The men in business suits were still there, still pretending not to watch her. Naomi knew this game. The pretending was part of it, part of the fabric of polite society. They could look at her, speculate, make quiet remarks, but when the time came to answer for it, the eyes would shift to the floor, to the window, to anything but her face. They did not want to see her. Naomi leaned back into her seat, pulling Ella closer. The plane tilted slightly, cutting through the thin air, but the real turbulence remained unseen. The next encounter came wrapped in artificial politeness. Amanda returned to the aisle, her eyes skimming the rows with the pretense of professionalism. But Naomi could feel the hesitation in each step. When Amanda reached Naomi's row, she stopped. "Can I get you anything else, Ms. Evans?" Amanda's voice was even, but the edges were too sharp. Naomi looked at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. "No, thank you," Naomi replied, her voice calm but deliberate. Amanda nodded, her posture rigid, but something flickered in her eyes, a quiet discomfort that lingered just beneath the surface. It was not guilt. Guilt was too soft. It was fear, the fear of being caught. Of being called to answer for the small violences she had already convinced herself were insignificant. Naomi recognized that fear. She had seen it in managers who hovered too long behind cash registers. In teachers who stumbled over their words at parent-teacher conferences. In the downcast eyes of shop owners who watched but never spoke. It was the fear of being exposed. Amanda's smile didn't return as she walked away. But Naomi saw the stiffness in her stride, the weight she carried now. Whether she wanted to or not. Good, Naomi thought. Let her carry it. As the hours stretched on, Naomi found herself staring out at the sky. The clouds breaking apart below the plane like islands floating in the distance. Ella had fallen asleep again, curled against Naomi's arm, her tiny fingers wrapped around a stuffed bear. Naomi could hear the faint murmur of voices around her, but they felt distant. She was too familiar with this landscape, the quiet isolation that came with being one of the few black faces in an all-too-white space. She thought about her mother. Her mother had often said, "The world will test you in small ways first. Naomi, it starts with the little things, so little you might not notice them. But when those small things pile up, they can crush you if you let them." Naomi hadn't understood it at 16. She understood it now. The smallest things, an unchecked assumption, a lingering stare, the summoning of police for no reason, could build into something far heavier than their individual parts. The truth was, Naomi wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of carrying a weight that was not hers to bear. It was during the descent when the final blow landed. The captain's voice drifted over the intercom, informing passengers they would soon begin their landing approach. Naomi adjusted Ella's blanket and began gathering her things, her mind already halfway to the ground. That was when she heard the man across the aisle speak softly. But just loud enough. People like that always make a fuss. Can't just sit quietly. Naomi paused, her hands tightening around the buckle of her seatbelt. It was barely more than a whisper. The kind of comment that slipped easily into the air, light enough to be denied if challenged. She turned her head, meeting the man's gaze directly for the first time. He froze, the smirk on his lips faltering. Naomi didn't say a word, but she held his gaze long enough to make him uncomfortable. Long enough to remind him that she had heard, long enough to strip away the comfort of anonymity he thought he held. The man looked away, his eyes dropping to the book in his lap. But Naomi didn't look away. She would not give him that escape. As the plane touched down, Naomi could feel the shift in the air, the collective relief of a cabin ready to disembark, eager to shed the tension that had followed them through the flight. Passengers stood, gathering their bags, exchanging pleasantries with the crew. Amanda appeared near the exit, her smile wide but brittle, thanking each passenger as they stepped off the plane. When Naomi reached her, Amanda hesitated, opening her mouth as if to say something, but Naomi stepped past her without acknowledgement. Some apologies were not worth hearing. Ella skipped ahead, holding tightly to Naomi's hand as they crossed into the terminal. Naomi exhaled slowly. The flight had ended, but the journey never did. The wheels touched down with a jolt, but Naomi Evans barely felt it. Ella stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes as the plane taxied toward the gate. Naomi gently brushed her daughter's hair aside, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. But Naomi's mind was elsewhere, already descending into the weight of what awaited her on the ground. Airports were strange places. They promised arrival but rarely offered rest. For people like Naomi, airports were liminal spaces, places where rules could bend without breaking, where the wrong glance or hesitation could shift the ground beneath your feet. Even after the plane landed, the plane slowed to a crawl, and Naomi let her eyes drift across the cabin. Passengers shuffled in their seats, reclaiming bags from overhead bins, pressing buttons to summon flight attendants. The tension that had lingered in the air for hours now clung to her like smoke. Across the aisle, the man who had whispered his last quiet insult sat stiffly, his gaze firmly fixed on the seat back in front of him. His hands fidgeted with his watchband, tightening it, loosening it, anything to avoid looking Naomi's way. She watched him, not out of spite but with the kind of observation that came from years of knowing exactly how this story ended. He would forget this encounter long before she ever did. Amanda Blake hovered near the front of the plane, waiting by the exit like a figure guarding a gate she did not own. Naomi saw the way Amanda's posture shifted as the line of passengers approached. The polite smile stretched across her face as though it were a mask she hadn't yet learned to wear properly. Naomi took her time, letting the others pass first. She could feel Amanda's gaze lingering, hesitant but expectant, as if hoping for some gesture of forgiveness, some sign that Naomi might absolve her quietly. Without words. But Naomi had long since learned the power of withholding absolution. When she reached the front, Naomi looked at Amanda, not with anger but with the kind of cool recognition that made people uncomfortable. Amanda opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize, but Naomi's gaze alone silenced her. Let her sit with it, Naomi thought. Let her wonder. She stepped off the plane without another word. The airport was a sea of movement. But Naomi moved through it with the practiced ease of someone who understood how to disappear in plain sight. Ella walked beside her, clutching Naomi's hand, eyes wide with wonder at the bustle around them. Children had the gift of forgetting, Naomi thought. Ella had already begun to let go of what happened on the plane, her attention drawn to the flashing screens and the chatter of strangers. Naomi wished it was that easy. At baggage claim, she stood quietly, watching the carousel creak to life. The slow procession of suitcases tumbling onto the belt. She could feel eyes grazing over her again, the faint pull of curiosity from passengers who had been on the same flight. Naomi recognized their glances. They weren't cruel, just uncertain. People didn't always know what to do with their discomfort, so they looked. Perhaps they thought they were offering sympathy. Perhaps they thought they were witnesses to something more important than it seemed. But Naomi knew the truth. Sympathy was a fleeting thing. She spotted her bag and gently lifted it from the carousel. Settling it beside her, Ella tugged on her sleeve, her voice soft. Mama, can we get something to eat? Naomi smiled faintly. Soon, baby. Let's get outside first. The crowd began to thin, but Naomi's steps slowed as they approached the terminal exit. She saw them before they saw her, two uniformed officers standing near the glass doors. For a moment, Naomi felt the air grow colder. She hadn't done anything wrong. She reminded herself of this fact. But the truth did not ease the tension curling in her chest. Why are there police, Mama? Ella asked, staring curiously at the officers. Naomi hesitated. They're just here to help, she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. But Naomi knew how the world worked. To people like Amanda, the presence of police felt like security. To people like Naomi, it felt like a warning. One of the officers made brief eye contact with her, and Naomi felt the flicker of recognition pass between them. He said nothing, made no move toward her. But the exchange lingered. The message was clear. We see you. Naomi tightened her grip on Ella's hand, guiding her gently through the terminal doors. She told herself she had made it through the hardest part of the journey. But that wasn't true. The hardest part had only just begun. In the backseat of the cab, Naomi watched the city slip by through the window. Ella leaned against her, half asleep, her small fingers wrapped around Naomi's arm. The airport was behind them, but Naomi's thoughts remained heavy with the residue of the flight. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a message from her attorney. Call me when you land. We need to discuss filing a formal complaint. Naomi locked the phone, exhaling slowly. She wasn't sure if she had the energy to fight this battle. But she also knew that silence was no refuge. She had been silent before, and silence had never saved her. Naomi looked down at Ella, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. For Ella's sake, she would fight, because the world had to be different for her. As the cab rolled on, Naomi felt the faint stirrings of something beneath the exhaustion, something sharper than anger, something heavier than disappointment. It was resolve, and she wasn't going to let this go. The city greeted Naomi Evans with its usual indifference, gray skies hanging low, the sound of tires hissing against damp pavement. She sat in the back of the cab, Ella asleep against her side, while the driver hummed along to an old jazz tune that drifted softly from the radio. Naomi watched the streets blur past, but her mind was not in the present. It lingered somewhere between the stale air of the plane and the too bright terminal where police officers had stood idle but present the quiet specters of authority that existed whether summoned or not. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated. She already knew who it was. The message she had ignored at baggage claim still glowed faintly from her screen. Her attorney, pressing her to respond. Naomi exhaled slowly and glanced at Ella's sleeping face. Filing complaints didn't erase memories. But Naomi had no illusions about silence. Silence was not protection, it was complicity. She shifted carefully, letting Ella's head rest against the seat, and pressed the phone to her ear. Naomi. Her attorney's voice was brisk, cutting through the low hum of the cab. I take it you landed safely. I did. And? There was no need for him to elaborate. Naomi knew what he was asking. There's nothing to tell you that you don't already know, she replied, her tone even. It played out the way it always does. She could hear the faint scratching of his pen against paper. I'll file the paperwork today. The airline will hear from us by the end of the week, he said. You'll have to make a statement eventually. Naomi glanced at Ella. Not today. Naomi. Not today, she repeated, more firmly this time. Her attorney paused, and for a moment Naomi thought he might press harder. But he didn't. He had known her too long for that. Fine, he relented, but don't wait too long. The longer you stay quiet, the more invisible this becomes. Naomi ended the call without responding. Invisible. The word felt heavier than it should have. She leaned back against the seat, letting the weight of it settle. When the cab pulled up outside their brownstone, Naomi was grateful for the quiet stretch of the block. She paid the driver, scooped Ella gently into her arms, and stepped into the cool evening air. The house stood still, wrapped in the faint hum of city life that lingered just beyond the threshold. Naomi carried Ella inside, tucking her carefully into bed without waking her. The house was too quiet, save for the faint creak of old floorboards beneath Naomi's steps. She sank into the worn leather of her living room chair, staring at nothing in particular. It should have ended there. But Naomi knew better. The email arrived the next morning. She found it while sipping coffee at the kitchen table. Ella still curled beneath the covers upstairs. Subject: Incident on Flight 2467. Formal acknowledgement. The airline's logo sat neatly at the top of the page. Sterile and indifferent. We are aware of the incident that occurred during your recent travel and take all matters of passenger experience seriously. Our team is conducting a thorough review of the situation. We apologize for any discomfort you may have experienced and appreciate your understanding as we investigate further. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. Discomfort. That was the word they chose. As if what happened had been the product of an accidental seat adjustment or a misplaced bag. Discomfort was a late meal. Discomfort was turbulence at 30,000 feet. But what Naomi had felt was not discomfort. It was the quiet erosion of dignity 1 inch at a time, with no apology deep enough to fill the space it left behind. She read the email twice, then closed the laptop without responding. They weren't speaking to her. They were speaking to themselves. Later that afternoon, while Naomi and Ella walked through the park, Naomi's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't her attorney. It was Clara, the young flight attendant from the plane. Naomi hesitated but answered. Ms. Evans? Clara's voice was softer than Naomi remembered. She sounded nervous, as if she'd thought better of calling halfway through dialing the number. Clara, Naomi replied, keeping her tone neutral. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Clara paused. Naomi could almost hear her swallow. I hope this isn't out of line. I wanted to apologize for everything that happened. Naomi stopped walking, letting Ella wander a few steps ahead. Clara rushed to fill the silence. I know I didn't say anything when it happened. I should have. Naomi's eyes followed her daughter, but her thoughts lingered elsewhere. You didn't call to apologize, Naomi said, not unkindly. Clara hesitated. No, I called because I don't know how to explain it. I've seen things like this before. Not just with you. And I didn't say anything then either. But I can't stop thinking about how Ella watched the whole thing. I guess I just wanted to say that you're sorry. Naomi finished for her. Yes. Naomi let the word hang in the air. Sorry. It was a fragile thing, so light it almost didn't exist. Thank you for calling, Naomi said, her voice softer now. Clara exhaled, as if releasing something she hadn't realized she was holding. I know it doesn't change anything, Clara added. Naomi watched Ella crouch near a patch of wildflowers, her small hands brushing over the petals. No, it doesn't, Naomi said quietly, but it matters that you said it out loud. When the call ended, Naomi didn't feel relief, but for the first time since stepping off that plane, she felt seen. She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked toward Ella, kneeling to meet her at eye level. Come on, baby, Naomi said, brushing Ella's cheek gently. Let's go home. And as they walked, Naomi carried the weight of the moment not with anger, but with the quiet certainty that silence, no matter how heavy, could be broken. It was the third email that told Naomi Evans everything she needed to know. There had been no sudden apology, no sweeping acknowledgement from the airline, just the slow drip of carefully worded correspondences, each one more indifferent than the last. We value your feedback, Ms. Evans. Feedback. Naomi exhaled through her nose, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. Ella was at the dining table, coloring quietly, her legs swinging beneath the chair. Why don't they just say it? Naomi muttered under her breath. Ella glanced up. Say what, Mama? Naomi smiled faintly. Nothing, baby. Finish your drawing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the oldest trick in the book to pretend that nothing had happened until the person who was wronged began to doubt it themselves. The airline wasn't trying to erase the incident. They were trying to outlast her. Naomi didn't sleep much that night. She sat by the window long after Ella had gone to bed, watching the city shift under the weight of darkness. The email still hovered in the back of her mind. We appreciate your patience as we continue our review. That word again, patience. Patience was the language of those who had the luxury of time. Patience had been preached to Naomi's grandmother when she sat in the back of a bus, waiting for the world to change. Patience had been the thin veil that draped over Naomi's mother as she watched her daughter walk through doors she could not. Naomi thought of the way Amanda Blake had looked at her on that plane, the careful, almost imperceptible disbelief that Naomi could sit where she sat, dress the way she dressed, exist the way she existed. There was no language polite enough to smooth the edges of that kind of judgment. Patience would not fix it. Naomi rose, padded softly to her desk, and opened her laptop. She began typing not a complaint, but a letter. The words flowed easily. To whom it may concern. I imagine this is the part where I'm supposed to express gratitude for your response. I won't. You see, I have spent much of my life learning the art of patience. I have waited in rooms where no one met my eyes. I have stood in lines while others passed without question. I have smiled politely as men like your flight attendant asked to see my ticket twice, as if it might vanish in my hand between glances. And I have watched, over and over again, as the people who make these mistakes are shielded by the same words you've offered me. We apologize for your experience. We appreciate your patience. Patience did not shield my daughter from watching police officers approach her mother over nothing. Patience did not undo the embarrassment of being pulled aside while strangers whispered behind me. I know that you hope this will fade. It won't. I don't write this letter for your sympathy. I write it because you need to understand something. This was not an isolated incident. It was a reminder that for all the progress you celebrate in boardrooms and advertisements, the people who serve on your planes and staff your gates still make assumptions about who deserves to sit where. And that assumption carries weight. It weighs on the shoulders of people like me every day, even after the plane lands. I hope you feel the weight of this letter, because I will not carry it alone. Naomi Evans. Naomi hovered over the send button. Her finger paused, but only for a breath. And then she pressed it. The reply came sooner than she expected. By noon the next day, Naomi's phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. This is Richard Hale, the man on the other end said, his voice measured but brisk. I'm the CEO of the airline. I read your letter, Ms. Evans. Naomi said nothing at first, letting the silence settle like dust. I wanted to call you directly. Hale continued, we clearly mishandled this, and I take full responsibility. I'd like to speak with you about how we move forward. Naomi leaned against the counter, watching Ella in the living room, twirling slowly to a song only she could hear. Mr. Hale, Naomi said finally, her voice even but cool. You don't need to take responsibility. You need to take action. A pause. I understand, Hale replied, though Naomi wasn't sure he did. We'll be revisiting our policies and retraining staff immediately. He added, his voice tightening as if reading from a carefully prepared list. I'd also like to extend an invitation for you to join our advisory board, help guide that process. Naomi's lips twitched. There it was. The invitation to become part of the solution to a problem she never created. But she expected this, and maybe, just maybe, this was the moment to step forward, not because she believed in their sincerity, but because she had learned that change didn't come from the outside looking in. Fine, Naomi replied, but let's be clear. Her voice sharpened, and Naomi could feel the weight of generations standing behind her. I'm not here to make you look good. I'm here to make sure this never happens again. Hale hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, that's exactly what we need. Naomi didn't believe that, but belief wasn't necessary. Only action. Later that evening, Naomi sat on the couch, Ella tucked under her arm. The TV flickered softly. But Naomi's mind wandered elsewhere. Her phone buzzed with emails, some from journalists, others from strangers who had somehow heard about the incident. She ignored them for now. Ella shifted, resting her head against Naomi's chest. Mama, are you still mad at that lady from the plane? Naomi pressed her lips to her daughter's hair. No, baby, she whispered. Then why did you write her a letter? Naomi smiled faintly. Because sometimes, she said softly, you have to remind people what they refuse to see. The news arrived quietly, in the same way injustice often does, slipped between headlines, buried beneath more urgent matters. Linda Blake, the flight attendant, had been dismissed. The email from Richard Hale made no mention of her by name. It was couched in corporate language, describing a need to uphold the highest standards of professionalism and inclusivity. Naomi Evans read it twice. Unmoved. There was no satisfaction to be found in the removal of one person. Dismissing Linda did not erase the thin, unspoken contract that had allowed her to act as she did. Linda was not the root. She was the flower. And Naomi knew that for every Linda forced to leave, there were others waiting quietly to take her place, groomed by systems that had survived far worse storms than one angry letter. She tucked her phone into her pocket, feeling the faint vibration of more emails arriving, responses from journalists who wanted to amplify her story. Naomi ignored them. She had no interest in becoming a symbol for people who would forget her name by the end of the month. At the park that afternoon, Naomi watched Ella chase after pigeons, giggling as they scattered into the air. The world felt different through Ella's eyes, softer, less guarded. Naomi envied that. But even as she smiled at her daughter's laughter, Naomi's thoughts drifted back to the plane, to the quiet tension that had sat beside her like an unwelcome passenger. Racism was not always loud. Sometimes it lived in the smallest gestures: a seat reassigned, a boarding pass questioned, a voice dropped half an octave lower when speaking to certain passengers. Naomi had seen it too many times to mistake it for anything else. Across the park, a man on a nearby bench watched them. His gaze lingered just a moment longer than Naomi liked. She met his eyes directly. He looked away. There it was again, the small offense. That evening, Naomi sat at her desk with Ella asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. The advisory board meeting with the airline was scheduled for the next day. Naomi had no doubt they would present her with charts and data, proof of their progress. Evidence of new training modules designed to scrub out unconscious bias. They would smile, shake her hand, and invite her to speak to employees, to become part of the narrative that painted the company as reformed. But Naomi had been in rooms like this before. She knew that corporations loved to drape progress over their shoulders like a fine coat, parading it for as long as the cameras lingered, only to fold it neatly away when no one was watching. And Naomi was tired of being anyone's coat. The next morning, Naomi entered the airline's headquarters dressed simply, but with the same quiet dignity that had unsettled Amanda Blake. The boardroom was filled with men and women in pressed suits, their smiles practiced, their eyes eager to show her their progress. Richard Hale greeted her with a firm handshake. Ms. Evans, thank you for coming. We're eager to hear your thoughts. Naomi smiled politely but said nothing. She let them speak first. A slideshow flickered to life, bulleted points about policy shifts, video clips of employees nodding earnestly during diversity training. It was a performance, but Naomi knew that even performances had their place. Still, when Hale finally turned to her and said, "We hope this addresses your concerns," Naomi felt the weight of the room settle on her shoulders. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "This is a start," she said carefully, "but I need you to understand something." The room stilled. Fixing Linda Blake does not fix your airline. Hale shifted, his eyes flickering briefly toward his colleagues, searching for support that would not come. Naomi continued, "You've trained your staff to smile at me, to apologize when the cameras are rolling, but you have not taught them to see me." The words hung heavy in the air. "I sat on that plane. In first class, with my daughter beside me, Naomi said softly, but there was steel in her voice. And no one questioned why I was there until someone decided I didn't belong. I didn't deserve that. She let the silence stretch long enough for it to become uncomfortable. I'm not interested in symbolic gestures, Naomi added. I'm interested in making sure no other black mother has to explain to her child why police officers boarded her flight to ask for a ticket she had already shown. Hale cleared his throat. We understand, Ms. Evans. I assure you. No, Naomi interrupted, her voice sharp but calm. I don't think you do. She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. I'll stay on this advisory board, Naomi said, locking eyes with Hale, but not because I believe in you. I'll stay because I believe in accountability. Hale nodded, though Naomi could tell the words unsettled him. And that was the point. Later, as Naomi stepped outside into the sunlight, she felt something shift, not in the world, but within herself. The weight of that flight. Of Amanda Blake's gaze. Of every man in first class who had whispered behind her back she was no longer carrying it alone. As Naomi walked toward her car, Ella's voice echoed softly in her mind. Mama, why did you write her a letter? Naomi smiled faintly as she opened the door, feeling the cool leather beneath her fingertips. Because, Naomi thought, some battles are won not by shouting but by refusing to disappear.